Hello, and welcome to the EPA and Department of the Army public webinar on the Waters of the United States Final Rule. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is being recorded. My name is Russ Kaiser, and I'm the Acting Director of EPA's Oceans, Wetlands, and Communities Division. Today, we are joined by management and staff from EPA and the Department of the Army. We will begin today's webinar with opening remarks and introductions, followed by an overview presentation of the final rule. I would like to turn your attention to a brief introduction from Brian Fraser, Acting Director of EPA's Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, followed by an introduction from Stacy Jensen, Director of Policy and Legislation in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works.
Thank you, Russ. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar regarding EPA and the Army's revised definition of waters of the United States. 50 years ago, Congress passed the Clean Water Act with the goal that our waters should be fishable and swimmable. The definition of waters of the United States is a term that is foundational to the accomplishing the goal. The final rule establishes a clear and reasonable definition of waters of the United States that balances essential clean water protections with the needs of all water users. This final rule supports public health, environmental protection, agricultural activity, economic growth. The final rule establishes a balanced definition of waters of the United States that stops the uncertainty that has harmed communities and our nation's waters for too long. The final rule officially replaces the Navigable Water Protection Rule, which was detrimental to the communities and vacated by several courts. The final rule provides much needed clarity to advance infrastructure projects, economic investments, and agricultural activities while protecting our waters. At this time, I will now turn it over to Stacy Jensen.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Stacy Jensen. I'm the Acting Director of Policy and Legislation in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. My office provides oversight and policy direction for the Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works program. I join EPA in thanking you for participating in today's webinar regarding EPA and the Army's revised definition of waters of the United States. This final rule recognizes the essential role of the nation's water resources in communities across the nation. And the rule was informed by feedback received during tribal consultation, our robust outreach efforts, and the Federal Register notice comment period. The agencies truly valued listening to tribal, co-regulator, and stakeholder input throughout the process. The rule's clear and supportable definition of waters of the United States will allow for more efficient and effective implementation and provide the clarity long desired by farmers, industry, environmental groups, and other stakeholders. In particular, the agencies worked hard to ensure the final rule language is clear and provides tools and resources to ensure implementation is consistent and transparent. The Army looks forward to advancing the next phase of the rulemaking action, which is the implementation phase, in an efficient and effective manner that continues to enable economic growth while protecting aquatic resources. We thank you again for joining us today, and I'll hand the presentation over to Whitney Beck to begin our final rule overview presentation.
Thank you, Stacy. In today's presentation, we will briefly cover some background on waters of the United States. However, the presentation will largely focus on the final rule framework, including the jurisdictional waters and exclusions. Waters of the United States is a threshold term in the Clean Water Act that establishes the geographic scope of federal protections under the Act. The Clean Water Act does not define waters of the United States. It provides discretion for the implementing agencies, EPA and the Army, to define waters of the United States in regulations. And in fact, the agencies have done this since the 1970s. The agency's definition and implementation of waters of the United States has evolved over time. The definition of waters of the United States is a foundational term under the Clean Water Act. This definition affects most programs that protect water quality under the Act, including water quality standards, impaired waters and total maximum daily loads, oil spill prevention, preparedness, and response programs, state and tribal water quality certification programs, and permitting programs, including for discharges of dredged and fill material. This slide highlights key regulatory changes and Supreme Court cases over time that have affected the definition of waters of the United States. Recent court decisions have reinforced the importance of establishing a stable and durable definition of waters of the United States. That brings us to our current rulemaking process. During the summer of 2021, the agencies initiated pre-proposal outreach and consultation with tribes and states. In December of 2021, EPA and Army published a proposed revised definition of waters of the United States in the Federal Register. The proposed rule was founded upon the pre-2015 definition of waters of the United States, with updates to reflect Supreme Court decisions. The public comment period closed in February of 2022, and the agency submitted a final rule package to the Office of Management and Budget in September of 2022. The final rule was signed in December of 2022 and was published in the Federal Register on January 18, 2023. The rule will be effective on March 20th, 2023. The final rule establishes a clear and reasonable definition of waters of the United States that balances essential clean water protections with the needs of all water users. The final rule is grounded in EPA and Army's longstanding authority provided by Congress through the Clean Water Act and refined by court opinions. Consideration of the best available science, over 45 years of real-world practical experience garnered by EPA and Army in implementing the Clean Water Act as directed by Congress, and extensive public input from diverse perspectives. The final rule includes 3 parts: Paragraph A, jurisdictional waters, Paragraph B, exclusions, and Paragraph C, definitions. We'll go into additional detail about each of the categories of jurisdictional waters, but they're listed for your reference on this slide. Traditional navigable waters, the territorial seas, and interstate waters remained unchanged from the pre-2015 regulations. However, the other categories of waters were revised to reflect the agency's interpretation of the statute, including consideration of relevant Supreme Court decisions. For instance, the agencies removed the interstate commerce tests from the pre-2015 A3 Other Waters category and added the relatively permanent and significant nexus standards to certain categories of waters. So that brings us to Paragraph B, exclusions. The first 2 exclusions are from the pre-2015 regulations, including waste treatment systems and prior converted cropland, but they have been modified in the final rule. The remaining 6 exclusions are the generally non-jurisdictional features under the pre-2015 regulatory regime added to the final rule as exclusions. The final rule also includes a section that defines key terms. A few terms are defined exactly the same as they were in the pre-2015 regulations, including wetlands, adjacent, high tide line, ordinary high water mark, and tidal waters. The agencies have added the term significantly affect to the final rule to provide clarity on the significant nexus standard. I'd like to explain a couple of key concepts before we discuss the final rule categories in more detail. First, the relatively permanent standard means relatively permanent, standing, or continuously flowing waters connected to Paragraph A1 waters, and waters with a continuous surface connection to such relatively permanent waters or to Paragraph A1 waters. Recall that paragraph A1 waters include traditional navigable waters, the territorial seas, and interstate waters. Second, the significant nexus standard means waters that either alone or in combination with similarly situated waters in the region significantly affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of paragraph A1 waters. We'll discuss how the relatively permanent standard and significant nexus standard will be implemented for specific water body categories later in today's presentation. The final rule defines the term significantly affect for purposes of determining whether certain waters meet the significant nexus standard. Significantly affect requires a material influence on the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of a paragraph A1 water. The final rule text includes functions to be assessed, which are indicators that are tied to the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of paragraph A1 waters. Examples of functions in the final rule include contribution of flow and trapping of nutrients. The final rule text also includes factors to consider, which are readily understood criteria that influence the types and strength of chemical, physical, or biological connections and associated effects on downstream paragraph A1 waters. Examples of factors in the final rule include distance from a paragraph A1 water and climatological variables. As I mentioned earlier, paragraph A1 includes 3 different categories of waters. The agencies are not making changes to the longstanding rule text or implementation of traditional navigable waters. The agencies have treated traditional navigable waters the same under all of the prior regulatory regimes, with the exception of the 2020 Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which allowed traditional navigable waters to be excluded if they met the criteria for one of the exclusions in the rule. In the final rule, the agencies are not making changes to the longstanding rule text or implementation of the territorial seas. The territorial seas have been treated the same under all of the prior regulatory regimes. The agencies also are not making changes to the longstanding rule text for interstate waters. However, the final rule preamble clarifies implementation of interstate waters. The preamble notes that lakes, ponds, and wetlands crossing state boundaries are jurisdictional as interstate waters in their entirety. For tributaries, interstate waters include the portion of the tributary of the same stream order as the portion that crosses or serves as a state line. Note that the agencies did solicit comment on how to address waters that cross between state and tribal boundaries, but the final rule preamble notes that the agencies intend to address such waters in a future action. Paragraph A2 of the final rule includes impoundments of waters of the United States. Impoundments are distinguishable from natural lakes and ponds because they're created by discrete structures like dams or levees that typically have the effect of raising the water surface elevation, creating or expanding the area of open water, or both. Impoundments can be natural, like beaver ponds, or artificial, like reservoirs. The agencies consider paragraph A2 impoundments to include 1, impoundments created by impounding one of the waters of the United States that was jurisdictional under this rule's definition at the time the impoundment was created. And 2, impoundments of waters that at the time of assessment meet the definition of waters of the United States under paragraph A1, A3, or A4 of this rule, regardless of the water's jurisdictional status at the time the impoundment was created. The biggest change here from pre-2015 practice is that waters that are jurisdictional under paragraph A5 do not retain their jurisdictional status under the impoundments provision, but they may still be determined to be jurisdictional under another rule category. Paragraph A3 of the final rule covers tributaries of traditional navigable waters, the territorial seas, interstate waters, and paragraph A2 impoundments. While the final rule does not define tributary, the preamble explains that the agencies will interpret tributary consistent with the agency's long-standing interpretation. Tributaries can include rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, and impoundments, as well as ditches and canals. Not all tributaries are jurisdictional under the final rule. To be jurisdictional, tributaries must meet either the relatively permanent standard or the significant nexus standard. The final rule preamble explains that relatively permanent waters include tributaries that have flowing or standing water year-round or continuously during certain times of year. Relatively permanent waters do not include tributaries with flowing or standing water for only a short duration in direct response to precipitation. In evaluating tributaries under the significant nexus standard, the agencies will determine whether the tributaries, either alone or in combination with similarly situated waters in the region, significantly affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of paragraph A1 waters. The agencies consider tributaries and their adjacent wetlands to be similarly situated waters that will be aggregated together within the catchment area of the tributary of interest for purposes of a significant nexus analysis. I'd now like to turn the presentation back over to my colleague, Stacy Jensen from the Department of the Army to continue our overview of the final rule.
Thanks, Whitney. So the next category of jurisdictional waters is paragraph A4, which covers adjacent wetlands. The final rule text includes the agency's long-standing definition of wetlands, as well as the long-standing definition of adjacent. The agencies have three well-established criteria to determine adjacency. If any one of the criteria is met, the wetland is adjacent, but may require further analysis to determine if it is waters of the United States. First, there is an unbroken surface or shallow subsurface connection to a jurisdictional water, which can be established, for example, where the wetland directly abuts the jurisdictional water, or by a non-jurisdictional physical feature that provides the direct connection between the wetland and a jurisdictional water, such as a pipe, culvert, non-jurisdictional ditch, or floodgate that has at least periodic flow. Second, the wetland is physically separated from a jurisdictional water by human-made dikes or barriers, or natural landforms, for example, river berms or beach dunes. Or third, the wetland's proximity to a jurisdictional water is reasonably close, such that adjacent wetlands have significant effects on water quality and the aquatic ecosystem. In the final rule, not all adjacent wetlands are jurisdictional. The three types of jurisdictional adjacent wetlands are listed on this slide. First, wetlands that are adjacent to a paragraph A1 water are automatically jurisdictional without the need for further analysis. Recall that A1 waters include traditional navigable waters, the territorial seas, and interstate waters. Second, adjacent wetlands that meet the relatively permanent standard are jurisdictional. Adjacent wetlands meet the relatively permanent standard when they have a continuous surface connection with a relatively permanent A2 impoundment or a relatively permanent tributary. And third, adjacent wetlands that meet the significant nexus standard are jurisdictional. As discussed previously, in implementing the significant nexus standard under the final rule, all tributaries and adjacent wetlands within the catchment area of the tributary of interest will be analyzed as part of the significant nexus analysis. The final rule text specifies that jurisdictional paragraph A5 waters include intrastate lakes and ponds, streams, and wetlands not identified in the other jurisdictional categories that meet the relatively permanent standard or the significant nexus standard. Since the 2001 Swank Supreme Court decision, the agencies have not in practice asserted jurisdiction over any of these features under the pre-2015 regulatory regime. Relatively permanent waters under paragraph A5 include surface waters that have flowing or standing water year-round or continuously during certain times of the year. In implementing the significant nexus standard, the agencies generally intend to analyze waters under paragraph A5 individually to determine if they significantly affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of a paragraph A1 water. This approach reflects the agency's consideration of public comments, as well as implementation considerations for waters assessed under paragraph A5. Finally, let's talk about the exclusions included in the final rule. Note that under the rule, paragraph A1 waters are not subject to the exclusions. Like the pre-2015 regulatory text, the final rule includes exclusions for waste treatment systems and prior converted cropland. In the final rule, the agencies are also codifying exclusions for several features that they generally considered non-jurisdictional under the pre-2015 regulatory regime. So let's talk a little more specifically about the regulatory exclusions. The final rule excludes waste treatment systems, including treatment ponds or lagoons, designed to meet the requirements of the Clean Water Act. In the preamble, the agencies provide clarification on how the exclusion will be implemented. The preamble specifies that even if waste treatment systems are excluded, they do not sever jurisdiction of upstream waters. The preamble also specifies that the exclusion is generally only available to the permittee using the system for the treatment function for which the system was designed. The final rule also excludes prior converted cropland. The rule maintains consistency with U.S. Department of Agriculture's implementation of the Food Security Act by providing that prior converted cropland under the Clean Water Act encompasses areas designated by USDA as prior converted cropland. Note that the final rule exclusion for prior converted cropland only covers wetlands. The regulatory text specifies that the exclusion would cease upon a change in use that renders the area no longer available for the production of agricultural commodities. Areas used for any agricultural purposes, including agroforestry, as well as areas left idle, generally remain available for the production of agricultural commodities. The final rule also includes exclusions for 6 features that were considered generally non-jurisdictional under pre-2015 practice. The rule excludes ditches, including roadside ditches, excavated wholly in and draining only dry lands, and that do not carry a relatively permanent flow of waters. The rule also excludes certain artificially irrigated areas, certain artificial lakes and ponds, certain artificial reflecting or swimming pools, and certain water-filled depressions. Finally, the rule excludes swales and erosional features, like gullies and small washes, that are characterized by low volume, infrequent, or short duration flow. The agencies have prepared an economic analysis to inform the public of potential effects associated with this rulemaking. In comparison to the regulatory regime that the agencies are implementing now and have been implementing for most of the past 15 years, the agency's primary estimate is that the final rule will have de minimis impact. The agencies expect that there will be a slight and unquantifiable increase in waters being found to be jurisdictional under the final rule in comparison to the pre-2015 regulatory regime. These increases are related to implementation of the relatively permanent standard and the significant nexus standard. The agencies have also prepared a technical support document which addresses in more detail the existing scientific literature and technical information in support of the final rule. The document includes a summary of the 2015 science report, connectivity of streams and wetlands to downstream waters, a review and synthesis of the scientific evidence, and more recent literature that has been published since the report's release. The 2015 science report provides much of the technical support for this final rule. The scientific literature published since the report's release is overwhelmingly supportive of the conclusions of the report and has expanded scientific understanding and quantification of functions that ephemeral streams and non-floodplain waters perform that affect the integrity of larger downstream waters, particularly in the aggregate. I would like to briefly cover the implementation memoranda that the agencies will be using to implement this final rule. First, EPA and Army have prepared a new coordination memo to ensure consistency of jurisdictional determinations under the final rule. The memo will be used to implement the final rule when it goes into effect. EPA and Army have also partnered with USDA to prepare a new agricultural memo to clarify the agency's roles and programs. The memo provides information about the prior converted cropland exclusion included within the final rule. I also wanted to clarify that EPA and Army will use their long-standing guidance on traditional navigable waters, which was formerly known as Appendix D, but is now titled Waters That Qualify as Traditional Navigable Waters under Section A1 of the agency's regulations. Finally, EPA and Army are retaining the 2020 ditch exemption memo that clarifies implementation of the ditch exemption under Clean Water Act Section 404F. And all of these materials are publicly available on the web. Thank you for your attention, and I will now turn it over to Russ Kaiser for closing remarks.
Thank you, Stacy. On behalf of EPA and the Department of the Army, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's public webinar. For more information, please visit www.epa.gov/WOTUS, WOTUS. EPA's website provides a link to the final rule Federal Register notice, as well as supporting documents like the economic analysis and technical support document. We've also posted summaries of federalism and tribal consultation, and I want to highlight that we have posted an overview fact sheet, a general agricultural fact sheet, and a landowner's fact sheet that includes practical information for how to determine if a Clean Water Act permit is required. Thank you again for your attention on this important issue. This concludes today's public webinar. Thank you.